Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Sit Around the Fire. This is the podcast where we have real, unfiltered conversations about mental health, personal growth, and what it takes to actually heal and show up fully in your life. And we're talking fully, authentically in your life. I am your host, Ashlea Dillard. I'm a therapist, a hypnotherapist, and a former first responder. And this podcast is here to challenge the way that you think, help you to reconnect with yourself, and remind you, of course, that transformation is always possible. Today, I'm very excited to be joined by a special guest from across the world, literally. So Dr. Rose Aghdami is here to talk with us today, and she is a chartered coaching psychologist, an author, and the creator of the Fuel Your Resistance model. Dr. Rose often talks about a really important question. If you're coping, but underneath, are you really just exhausted, overwhelmed, and completely running on empty? Because if so, she says that your resilience is running low. Rose has built her whole approach to building resilience around challenging the myth that resilience just means pushing through. Her Fuel model helps people make better decisions and feel calmer under pressure, more confident, clearer in their thinking, and more energized. She is recommended by the British Psychological Society to the media as a trusted expert on resilience. So, with all that being said, welcome to the show, Dr. Rose.
Thank you, Ashley, and thanks for the introduction. I'm delighted to be here.
Absolutely. I really appreciate you taking the time and coming onto the show, and I was very excited when our paths crossed because one of the topics that stood out to me most that you work with is this conversation around resilience. So I'm excited to dive into that with you today.
Thank you.
So first things first is to the person who's listening to our conversation today, what is the number one thing that you want them to walk away with after hearing our conversation?
I think the main message I'd like to get across is that resilience can be learned. We all have some level of resilience. It might be greater, it might be lesser. It's a bit fluid, depending on circumstances. It can be stronger or it can be reduced somewhat depending on what we're going through, but we can always increase the level of resilience that we have when we know the sort of skills that help that along. So I think that idea that some people are simply more resilient than others, or they don't come across so many challenges, something like that is one to put aside, and instead to recognize that it's a skills-based quality and we can all learn to become more resilient. So that's the number one thing that I would like people to know.
So walk us through your take on resilience. If you had to give resilience a definition, what does that actually mean? Because I know we spoke about this pre-recording, is it gets a bad rap and a weird name, resilience.
Yeah.
And almost like a badge of honor.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about how do you go about teaching people or helping people understand what is actually resilience?
Yeah. So a quick definition is that resilience enables you to deal with whatever life throws at you. A slightly more detailed definition is that resilience is the capacity to recognize, face, and cope well with challenges and difficulties. And it's those three things, really. We have to recognize that there are challenges and difficulties in our path, so we don't just suppress and look the other way when life gets tough. So we have to face them. We have to think, okay, this is something that I need to get through or get over or get round somehow or other. And then we need to know that we can cope well with them, or at least well enough. We're not going to like all of these challenges or difficulties that we face, but that's okay. We're built to deal with that. So the definition of resilience for me is that, we can recognize, face, and cope well with challenges that come in our paths, with stress, adversity, crises, and we will have the confidence to know that we'll cope well enough.
One of the words you used in that definition there was the word acceptance, which I think is very difficult for all of us sometimes, is to accept that either we're in the place of life that we are, or we're in the midst of a situation or a season that we are. But Why do you find that it's so difficult for us to embrace the acceptance piece?
Mm. I think that we often hold unrealistic expectations that we either don't deserve or we shouldn't need to deal with difficulties, that it's somehow unfair. So I think that acceptance can take a different perspective on it really and embrace that this is part of life. You know, the ups and the downs, the difficulties in life help us to recognize the liberation and liberating sides of life as well. So it's this mix that is being authentically alive, this mix that we can embrace and recognize that we have the capacity to deal with these elements of life and to accept that is very liberating, I think. I think that, you know, when we are not restricted by either unrealistic expectations or restricted by anxieties about what happens if this unwelcome event occurs and what if I don't cope with that. You know, it's very restricting because people can start to avoid things. And when you accept that some things will go better than others, some things won't go very well, some things will go really well. You don't always know which is which to start with. But once you accept that you will be okay, you know, once you've got the skills that build up resilience in place, you're going to be okay, whichever of those you're dealing with, whether it's something difficult, whether it's something that's going to turn out well or not so well, you'll be okay anyway. That's very liberating, I think. You can really live life large then. Otherwise, people can live quite a small life, you know, riddled with anxiety or ruled by anxieties and resistance. And I think that when people try and resist what life brings them, then that can be very energy draining. It can be very triggering of self-doubts. Confidence can go down, and that's when life starts to feel rather small.
Yeah, I'd like how you mentioned this around living in that fear-based thinking of what's going to happen next. What if this happens? So let's talk to the person who, let's say they're sitting in this anxiety driven mindset. What's some important advice pulling in the resilience side that you would offer this person, or even a place to start? Because sometimes it feels very big, it feels very overwhelming, but where do you encourage people to even start moving out?
Yeah. Well, this is where the model I put together, based on other people's research, this comes into its own really because it has four elements. Each element begins with the letters F, U, E, and L, which is where the fuel word comes from. And I hope, and I'm told by people who use it that it is so, that it's easy to remember and easy to apply. So the elements are F stands for flexibility. U is use your resources, internal and external. E is energize, do things that give you energy, not so many things that drain you. And L is looking at locating your control. And so when somebody does feel overwhelmed, to run through those four elements and see where could there be scope for me to make a change within one or more of those elements. Do I need to be more flexible in my thinking, my feeling, my behavior, the way I see myself? That flexibility in self-identity is important. Is the scope for me to use more resources? Either my internal resources, my skills, my experience that I carry with me all the time, or external resources. Do I need to reach out to somebody, find some more information from out there, ask my support system, my support circle for help and support? Some people find that very difficult. You know, it's not surprising that it doesn't always happen immediately. Coming on to the E of fuel, do I need to energize? Do I feel drained? And if so, what sort of energy do I need? Do I need physical energy? Do I need emotional energy? Do I need cognitive energy? What is it that I need? And then act on that. And then the last one, locate your control. We vary, all of us, on a continuum of what's called the locus of control. And some people believe that external events shape their experiences of life, other people, the weather, circumstance, politics, and they feel a little bit like a leaf in the wind in a way, because if things happen out there that sway them in one direction. It might not last, and then something else happens. They sway in another direction. And so they feel quite helpless and passive. And that's not a very grounded experience to have. At the other end of the continuum is the internal locus of control, which is where people believe that they shape their own experiences, not shape the world or shape what happens in the world, but they shape the way they respond. And so that's another scope of change when somebody feels that they're overwhelmed. Can I do something to increase my sense that I can take charge of what's happening to me? And there are two questions that really help strengthen that feeling. One is, what options do I have? Always options, almost always options. And then the second question is, which option will I take? Not could I take or might I take, but which option will I take? And so that, usually we feel better immediately if we're doing something to help our situation. And that's one way of combining that, developing the internal locus of control and also being proactive to make some changes. So you asked, what would I recommend to people who are feeling overwhelmed and perhaps feeling that they're not too resilient in their current situation? I would suggest they go through those four elements and see where there is scope to change.
I really, really like this formula, and I hope people go back and rewind and listen to that part again, because there's a lot of good information out of that very simple, practical 4-letter acronym that you brought up. And speaking to flexibility here, I think that is so important for us to look at flexibility, because I know in my life, I'm not the greatest at flexibility either. Is like I like things to go the way that they go, and I get very stuck in my routines and rhythms. But learning more about the why behind that, why the flexibility is hard, I think also helps to empower and encourage people to understand you didn't just land here overnight for no reason. Like your nervous system, your mind picked up all these patterns and likes that. But exploring flexibility, even on a scale where you're not asked to just completely uproot everything and turn over it all, but little bits of flexibility at a time, I found personally pay off quite big.
Mm. Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think it's also, I find it helpful to remember that there is a purpose to the rigidity. Rigidity is the enemy of resilience, really, but I think we can understand why it's there. People get drawn to familiarity, they get drawn to certainty, and so they tend to resist change, whether it's change in thinking, in change in their circumstance, because it is quite comforting to believe you know what's going to happen next. And so, people stay in jobs because they know people there, they know what's expected of them, they know what their salary package is likely to be. They have that sense of predictability, which is comforting. And so even if it's very pressured, even if it's an uncomfortable comfort zone, that familiarity can sometimes override the feeling that really a change would be in their, interests. So I think just to be sort of self-compassionate about that, really, and to recognize that this is perfectly normal. We need to know how to be self-protective, but we also need to know what the helpful version of that is and what the unhelpful version of that is. There's normally a helpful and an unhelpful version of most things we do.
Yes.
So to trust ourselves to be able to spot what belongs where is a good skill. And
Mhm.
it's part of confidence, of course, and part of experience of trying new things. But I think because it is quite natural to resist change. I think to be kind to ourselves, we can sometimes we can make changes in very small steps, so that hopefully it's not too daunting. We just try it out, a bit of an experiment, and see what happens,
Mhm.
and notice what happens, and notice that flexibility in thinking and in feeling is okay, and it can sometimes result in really good results. So just getting practiced at that it can be really helpful. And at the same time, being understanding and kind to ourselves, to not beat ourselves up for not leaping into something new, but recognizing this is a natural tendency is to stay with the status quo and not make too many changes. But it can be a gilded cage, you know. It can be that we stay in situations for far too long because of this reluctance to change. So that's where that sense of recognizing whether or not it's helpful is important.
Yeah, that familiarity that you talk about is is like choosing that hell we know over and over again just because it's familiar,
Yeah.
even though it holds us back or it causes more suffering, but it just because it's familiar, we you stay with it, which is like a gilded cage. It's a perfect metaphor to put that way. I really appreciate what you spoke about the side of compassion and practice because this is something we're really good at being very hard on ourselves. Very we're more gracious with others sometimes than we are with ourselves, but this idea around compassion and practice, for me, one of the things I started doing is I've walked through a narrative and a pattern of all liking to do things myself, just wanting to do it myself or not feeling like I needed to ask for help. And even the simplest little thing of saying yes when someone offers to help, whether it's opening the door or taking the trash out or something small like that, just saying yes, even though I could totally do it and nothing catastrophic would happen. But it was important for me to recognize those are little places where I could start to practice this idea of saying yes and being compassionate with myself so that when the bigger stuff comes up, it doesn't feel as big or as daunting because I'm already creating safety and creating resilience, like you say, in saying yes and asking for help and that flexibility and letting go.
Yeah, that's really good to hear, and I think that's a really good way of approaching it by taking small steps like that. Because many people have been raised to believe that independence is the gold standard, as it were. Independence has been rewarded for many people as they've been growing up, yeah, and so to reach out and ask for help can, for some people, seem as though it's admitting weakness or admitting that you can't manage. But in my view of resilience, it's not about just pushing through and keeping on, keeping on. It's about recognizing we're human beings because these emotions are what make us wonderfully human. We're not blocks of wood, we're not robots, thank goodness. Um, and to recognize that, yeah, at times we might even feel some shame at asking others for help. We might feel a failure because we're not managing on our own. And so to recognize that and be compassionate to ourselves and be kind and accept those vulnerabilities and that sense of insecurity that comes up sometimes does mean, I think, that we can then start to, excuse me, uh, think about what could I ask. You mentioned somebody taking out the trash, for example, and I think for people who find it difficult to ask for help because of what I've just explained, it can help to get used to that and to develop a new habit by asking for something very specific, rather than just saying, "Oh, I feel overwhelmed. Can you give me a hand? Can you help with this? I feel as though I've got too much to do, too much on my plate." To ask for something really specific is easier, I think. I don't know if you'd agree with that from your direct experience. But, could you help? Could you perhaps proofread this report? Or could you help me with carrying something that I can't manage on my own at the weekend? Whatever it is, a specific task can often be easier to ask for help with, rather than the general feeling that I'm just not managing and I should be able to manage because of those voices that were perhaps from other people in the
Mhm.
past. Mm.
And let's dive into that a little bit more because I think that's valuable information for people to understand is that critical language that shows up. And we know that this shows up in a lot of the folks that you work with too. And I do as well as the high functioning group of people. And so let's talk a little bit about how that critical voice or that perfectionism starts to show up in this type of person, or and kind of breaking down what exactly that looks like.
Yeah, the way I see it is that some people are raised not just by parents. It's not a sort of a blame thing here. It's just, again, accepting that we have a lot of influences upon us, whether it's to do with um, teachers, colleagues, bosses, as well as perhaps parents and other adults that we spend time with as we're growing up. Um, but for many people, they're raised with the message that doing is very rewarded. And then their self identity may develop based on their doing, their achievements, their tangible achievements, their school grades, the roles they get in their jobs, and so on. And they tend to overlook the value of the being part of us as human beings. And so I think that's sometimes where the perfectionism can develop, because the self worth is based on doing perfectly. And so for somebody who then becomes overwhelmed and could do better with help from others or delegating, for example, it's very, very difficult to do that because they're losing a sense of control over the way things are done, the standard to which they're done. And it can feel almost easier, but it's not really. But in the short term, it might seem easier to just do it themselves. And then they'll know it's done to their standard, it's done in their way, it's done in the familiar manner, rather than ask for somebody else and risk the same thing being done either in a different way or to a lesser standard. So this is where the perfectionism can creep in. And of course, in some situations, it's a really good thing. You know, for some things, things have to be done extremely well, but many people take that and generalize it to mean everything has to always be done to a perfect level. And sometimes, and this is very difficult for perfectionists or people with that tendency to accept, sometimes good enough is good enough. But it takes trusting oneself to know when that is applicable.
Yeah, no, I like what you said here with how early this starts, because I think of, being in grade school or even going through school. You mentioned good grades, but I mean, how early on is it? You do a good job on your lesson or your homework and you get a gold star. And instantly that starts to reaffirm and perpetuate this line of thinking that my actions dictate my worth. And then the race is on at that point, because now we continue to build that narrative in our head. We live under that, and that, like you mentioned at the end, good enough is good enough. That can feel very uncomfortable for people and not even be able to really understand what that concept means, because that perfectionism, that striving to perform, has been so strong for so long.
Yeah, exactly that. And I think with the best will in the world, some teachers and perhaps parents have always hoped that their emerging student, the child as they grow up, will always strive to get the very best mark. You know, so, oh, you only got a B? What was wrong with getting an A? You know, why didn't you get an A? Or an A star, even if that's possible. Why only a B? And for some children, teenagers, B would be perhaps as good as they can get. You know, the ability can reach a B, but perhaps no more than that. To be realistic, you know, we all are good or not so good at different things. But that message that things are only good enough if they are perfect or at the very highest standard. And that then leads to a person's value. That's a very hard one because I suppose it's because people hear it, you know, hundreds or even thousands of times as they're growing up. So it's a very difficult one to shift, which is why I mentioned good enough is sometimes good enough is a very big step for many people to take.
Yes, absolutely. And creating, like you said, that flexibility around exploring what that feels like. Good enough is good enough, and nothing catastrophic happens. And it's so freeing when you get into that mindset, when you can let go of that perfectionism and let go of that needing to be in control, like you mentioned. So, Dr. Rose, tell us how do you start to break this down for people? How do you start to, like, working with the high functioning folks out there? Where do you even start with these people, because this is a lot to dive into for someone who's probably been practicing that frame of mind for a long time, decades. So how do you even start to break this apart for people?
Well, I think to start with, it's helpful to reassure people that we're not talking about lowering standards or being sloppy or accepting substandard behavior or results. What we're doing is more looking at what is realistic and what is unrealistic. And so, as we were talking before about delegating and asking others or not asking others to help with work, in case it's not done in the same way, it doesn't mean that the different way of doing things will mean a shoddier result. It doesn't mean that that's going to be less good than the person's own way of doing things. So I think it's important that people who are trying to address this are aware that making changes won't mean compromising standards. I'm all for being ambitious and holding high standards, but they do need to be realistic and not unrealistic in whatever way that is relevant. So that's the very first thing, just to clarify that in their own minds. I would hope that that would enable a person to feel at least somewhat curious to take some new steps. And as you were saying, the small things first is a very good place to start. I would ask people what their best version of the current difficult situation could possibly be. Because when somebody can imagine something being done differently, then they're sort of halfway there, really. So we'd look at how they would imagine that the current pressures, their current challenges could be dealt with in a realistically positive way that would be helpful. Just referring back to what I said earlier about emotions and how, we don't want to suppress emotions that we have, the anxieties or the uncertainties and the sense of unfamiliarity, the vulnerabilities and the insecurities, just to confirm that it's fine to experience all of those. We're not likely to be derailed by experiencing a wide range of emotions. So we don't have to suppress those. We can embrace them, we can name them. It's often helpful to name the emotion because then we know what we're dealing with. And then talk about, let's say, some anxiety management techniques if that's relevant. And so the person will feel more equipped to deal with the uncertainty. And talking of that, one really simple, quick, can't even call it a strategy, it's too simple, but way of regulating our physical state when we are anxious and feeling overwhelmed. Of course, we're tense, we're clenching fists, we're got, tight shoulders and so on. A really quick way of resetting our physical state is to drop our shoulders and breathe out. That in itself will make a difference. And then we're able to think more clearly. And a person who has perhaps been for weeks and months in that tense state will have almost lost sight of what it feels like to be able to think clearly. Because, when we're in that tense state, the fight or flight response, really, our thoughts aren't clear. They're like thoughts going round and round and round as if they're items in a washing machine. You can't really distinguish which bit belongs where. So for a person to just reset the physical state, drop shoulders, breathe out, ideally carry on with that low breathing, their thinking will be so much clearer. And that's a really good step to start with. And then other anxiety management techniques or confidence techniques or communication skills, those small things that make all the difference, that build a person's confidence to be able to then take some steps to making changes which would lead to that best version of this situation.
I think it's a really beautiful technique, and often we overlook how powerful breathing is.
Yeah. Yeah.
It really is helps move emotion and move that energy so well that we forget it's so very simple. I know one of the things that comes up a lot in my work is this hesitancy towards these emotions. Like you mentioned, vulnerability and insecurity and all anxiety, those emotions, really any emotion, is people I don't think we're ever taught really how to handle emotions or what to even do with emotions, period. But I'm wondering what are some of the things that you see from people when they start to feel safe enough to experience emotion, or they can put a name to an emotion, or even just a body sensation to an emotion, is how you work this through with these high functioning adults who have learned a lot of suppressing and pushing down and not feeling things. Is how do you start to, again, like little by little, open them up to living with an open heart to experience emotions that way?
Yeah, yeah, it's a really relevant question. The way I like to explain it, as you say, many people haven't really had an opportunity to think very much about that inner world, for lots of different reasons. But the way I try and explain it is that just as our senses give us information about the external world and we can act on that information. So well, slight pun, given the name of your podcast, if we get too close to the fire, we draw back. We wouldn't touch the flames because we notice it's getting hotter and hotter, even if we were intrigued or wanted to reach out and correct something in the fire or something. We take the information from our senses and we act on that. We might smell something going on around near our house or something. We would go and investigate, and then perhaps call an expert or a responder if that was necessary. So we act on information from our senses, what we see, what we smell, what we feel, and so on. Similarly, emotions give us information about our internal world. They are often masked by, I would say, easier emotions to experience. For example, anger. A lot of anger shown and expressed by high functioning people. They might tell me that they are infuriated by the staff who aren't able to manage the tasks they're given. They might be really angry that something has been done that was not following protocol or without consultation with them. So there's a lot of anger around very often. Now, anger can be justified, but very often it's a vehicle for a more difficult emotion. So I will always ask somebody, might there be an emotion behind that anger? And I'll give them a little hint that it could often be either hurt or fear. Might not be, might be loneliness, might be a feeling of rejection, it might be other things, but very often those more difficult feelings to sit with are masked by anger. And so let's say somebody is a high functioning senior executive is very angry because decisions were made without consultation with him or her. So when we go into this conversation, they may be able to identify that actually they're pretty scared. They're scared that they are dispensable. They're scared that other things are happening without them being consulted because perhaps those other people who've made the decisions don't consider his or her opinions valuable enough to take time to explore. So there might be fear. There might also be the hurt, which is very commonly masked by anger, to believe that perhaps they have been a bit dismissed in this situation, feeling hurt by that. So anger, I would explore in that way. And then generally the underlying emotion, of course, is the one to investigate and address. So we can then put the anger on one side because it's very understandable, but to really explore. So what is that sense of fear about? Is it justified? Does it come from past experiences? Is it applicable in this setting? Is there any evidence to support the fear in this setting? Or maybe there isn't. Maybe there is. Maybe there isn't. But it's that underlying emotion that then needs exploring. If it's the hurt, why is that the immediate response? Perhaps they were too busy. Perhaps it's nothing personal at all. We would again look at the evidence for that. So it's looking at the underlying emotions that are there and then looking to what information is that giving the person that they can then act on. So that's how I would introduce the notion of first of all identifying and then um, making use of the emotions in order to work out what information is given and how best to use that in a helpful way.
It makes so much sense too, from a logical standpoint, is the curiosity around what's coming up, what's the message underneath, the messenger essentially. And it reminds me when I was listening to you speak about that, you probably have seen it based on the work that you do, the anger iceberg
Yep.
of anger being on the top of the surface as the surface emotion, but then there's this huge chunk of ice and all these other things that are underneath the surface, and exploring what's really underneath the anger
Right.
is really a powerful way of describing it. Like, you have hurt or fear or things like that. It's not just simply anger, but that exploring that and starting to be curious about it and understanding that there are no bad emotions. That's one thing I like to really educate and, put the message out there that there's no good or bad emotions. They're just emotions. But
Yeah.
we've given
Yeah.
them good or bad things, and the bad ones we don't want to feel. The good ones sometimes we don't even want to feel either. And so it's just realizing emotions are just energy in motion, and being curious and listening to the messages, and everything moves and burns off. Nothing lasts for forever.
Mm. Well, that reminds me of how sometimes some people find it helpful to be reminded that feelings aren't facts. Just because we feel a failure, perhaps in a certain situation, doesn't mean we are necessarily. So, just because we feel rejected doesn't mean we actually are. That's a different question. Is there any evidence for that? And then be checked out. But yeah, the notion of getting familiar and fluent really with our emotions and naming them, I think, can be enormously helpful.
Yeah, that's so valuable for people to hear, I think, and understand. So let's talk a little bit about your book, because I want to make sure that we speak to this. So, How to Fuel Your Resilience, a practical guide to developing resilience skills for professionals. So, Dr. Rose, tell us a little snapshot about what is in this book of yours that you put together, and I'm sure tons of wisdom coming at everyone who's reading it.
Well, thanks for your kind words. Um, it came about because when I was working in I have a clinical and counseling psychology background. And then that transitioned into coaching psychology more and more as time went on. When I was working in a clinic with often quite um, difficult cases, people were presenting with burnout, they were presenting with absolutely extreme mental exhaustion. And it was a clinic which was both inpatient and outpatient. So sometimes these patients would be admitted for, sometimes many weeks with exhaustion and burnout. And I saw how, first of all, that presentation was increasing year after year. And secondly, how difficult it was for everybody concerned once that point was reached. It was, of course, difficult for the individual. It was difficult for their families. It was difficult for their teams. It was difficult for the employers or their senior individuals they worked with, not only during the crisis, but also afterwards. The individual would be wondering very often if they are going to be trusted with the really interesting, complex work ever again. The employer would, or business partners would be wondering whether it was even fair to give this individual the really interesting, complex aspects of the work ever again. Um, and the family often didn't quite know how best to handle this situation. Teams often sort of fell apart, or projects got put on ice and left until the individual was in a position to return to work. And so the consequences and the ripple effect, the negative ripple effect, was huge. So I started to look into what could be the best antidote to this. And of course, it's often anxiety related, exhaustion related, pressure, stress related. And through lots of study and reading other people's research, I I came to recognize that resilience is really the best safeguard to stress, pressure, overwhelm, burnout. Um, and so I, again, from other people's research, put together the four elements that had been identified as the key um, elements that make up resilience. And so that's where the F, the U, the E, the L came from. Um, so I was building this into either when I had therapy clients as a clinical psychologist, I would build into the last few sessions of a course of sessions, however long it had lasted. The last few sessions, I would suggest that we looked at resilience as something that, a set of skills that they could take with them. And generally, people were very open and happy to do that. With coaching clients, I pretty much built in the resilience work all the way through because there was generally not so much the repairing work that you can have with therapy clients. Um, and I got good feedback. People like the fuel model. They see it as a very practical way of both remembering what to run through, like a checklist really in your mind, and the ways of developing these skills are also pretty simple. As long as you do them, that's the most difficult part is remembering to do them, actually.
Mhm.
Um, and so, and people would say, well, is there a book or something on this so that I can take it with me and refer back and remind myself? There was in those days a chapter. I'd contributed a chapter to somebody else's book about general coaching methods and so on. So that was the best I had to give people, plus a summary information sheet. Um, but more and more people asked. And so I thought, well, perhaps this is really something to focus on. And spoke with the publisher. They were very positive about the idea. And here we have it now. It's out in the world, the book. So I do hope that it will be helpful for people as a almost like a reference guide. It runs through the why it's important to be resilient. It runs through the different elements. And the way I have written it, it's very conversational. It's for professionals in all sectors. It's not just for mental health professionals, but them as well, or coaches, counselors to use either for themselves, as well as to pass on to their own clients. Um, it's got a lot of illustrations in it, case studies, just to show how best to apply the strategies that I've included in the book. And really, underpinning it is the aim for people to develop a resilient mindset and a resilient lifestyle. So, of course, that does include, physical health, nutrition, drinking enough water to stay hydrated and so on. My focus, as I'm the psychologist, not the nutritionist or the physical trainer, is on the psychological resilience. But of course, I include mention of those other areas as well. So, my hope is that it will help people to know more about what resilience is and why it's worth developing some habits to nurture that. And for them to, as I mentioned before, feel more liberated, more prepared for whatever comes in life. So people don't have to believe, or I'm not a person to do that, or I'm just not a person to try out new things or meet new people or whatever it is that they have believed all these years, but that they can recognize that step by step, if they want to, they can embrace these things and manage pressure, manage uncertainty well, cope with challenges well, and so live a fuller life really.
Wow. I'm gonna go on an order right now because I looked it up earlier and I was like, "Oh, well, this is my cup of tea anyways." But I love just the way that you framed the idea around resilience and what it means and it's not that grind harder than not push harder, keep doing kind of mentality. But I think it's so important for people to learn what real true resilience is. And you've given such practical tools of how to be able to do that. So one thing I want to tap into before we close out our conversation is I saw this quote on your website that I really enjoyed. It says, strengthen self, strengthen others. So can you give us some background on what does this mean to you? What does this mean when you said this, and how does this implement into your work or into the mission of what you're doing?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for mentioning that. Um, I believe we can't give to others what we don't have ourselves. Um, so, in order to be um, something of a model for resilience, we need to be resilient ourselves. We need to deal with challenges, not shy away from them. We need to face them. We need to be flexible in thinking of solutions. We need to be prepared to put aside our previous ways of thinking of ourselves and embracing new identities. I remember one very uh, gifted client who, everybody in his field of work wanted him to work for them because he was a real sort of rising star. And he came to see me because he had accepted somebody's offer of a new role. Um, but he had to shift his self-identity because he was used to working in a company with a vertical hierarchy. So he was the prince. Everybody
Mhm.
was bowing and scraping and thinking he was fantastic, which he was. But the new company had a flat hierarchy, and he couldn't quite work out where he stood here because everybody was respecting everybody else, not just him. Everybody was admiring everybody else's work, not just his. So that's just a small example of this being prepared to shift your self-identity. So for him, once he recognized that being generous about others' achievements, realistically and authentically, did not dilute his own,
Mhm.
and other ways of working that through, he was able to be comfortable with that and realize he didn't have to have a throne or a sort of virtual throne. And actually, it meant he was closer. You can't really be close to somebody if they're up there on a pedestal. But he was able to communicate better, integrate better, and so on and so on. So that's just a small example of being open to these different ways of doing things. And so in order to really um, strengthen oneself, in order then to strengthen others, I think whether it's a therapist or a mental health professional who have clients who are perhaps asking for support in this, or whether it's somebody in a professional role who is just demonstrating resilient behavior and resilient mindset, or somebody in the community who is demonstrating that it's fine to face and head on challenges and not avoid them, and use flexible ways of thinking about things, use resources authentically and willingly and openly, energize, give themselves permission to do what energizes, because we really have to do that. It's a bit like expecting a high performance car to run on empty and be really good at what it's meant to do. It can't do that, nor can we. We need to make time to recharge. And I think it's a helpful message because it helps to give people permission, which it can be difficult. I don't know how often I hear people say, inside or outside my work role, "Oh, I feel so guilty if I'm not working all the time." You think, well, don't forget that re-energizing, refueling is absolutely essential for you to then be able to have enough to give to others. And then also the locus of control, being able to demonstrate that we can take charge of our experience of something, not the way we respond. And so being something of a model of those different skills and habits, I think, can help to make sense of the strengthen self, strengthen others quote.
Wow. I think that is a perfect way to bring it all together, honestly. That was such a powerful bit of information there, and that permission piece is so People can't hear that enough. I need to hear it more often, that giving ourselves permission. So thank you for that. Well, I want to make sure that people know how to reach out to you to get connected with you to do work on the resilience side of things and kind of as you've identified through your book. So we'll make sure that we link the book in the show notes so that people can get directly to that. And we'll make sure that we put your website in there as well. But is there any other good way or what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Thanks. I guess the website is the best way because that includes a bit of information about the book, and it includes a contact form and my email address. And otherwise, I'm also on LinkedIn, which is a very widely spread
Mhm.
platform, of course. That it'd be great to link up with people who might be interested or who have perhaps some sort of affinity with the work that I'm doing. So that's another way to get in touch.
Okay, perfect. Well, Dr. Rose, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show and taking the time and sharing all of this amazing information. And the work that you've done around resilience is just so incredibly powerful. So, thank you for taking the time to hang out with us. And we will definitely support you. And I'm going to be getting the book. I will go order it today. So, I'm very excited to implement it into my work as well. So,
Thank you. That's really great to hear. And it was a real delight to be here and to speak with you, Ashley. So thanks for the opportunity.
absolutely. Well, all of you who are listening, thank you as always. We couldn't do this without your support. So, thank you for taking the time to sit around the fire with us today. And I know that, like me, you're walking away with a lot of really good information today and some practical tools you can put into play right now. So, if this was helpful for you, you know it's going to be helpful for someone else. So, make sure that you like the episode, share the episode. Make sure that you're subscribed so you don't miss out on any other powerful conversations like this today. And thank you for your support. Remember that you are loved, you are accepted, and you're valued in all ways. And we're incredibly glad that you're here with us and look forward to sitting around the fire with you again very soon.